Dust settled over the gallows where Amira stood, a freshly seared brand burning into her shoulder. She wasn't a criminal, just a girl who knew too much. When a towering hermit from the Bitterroot High Country tore her from the hangman's grasp, her real fight for survival finally began. Blackwood Gulch was a mining town that thrived on dirt, sweat, and the ruthless exploitation of anyone too weak to defend their stake. On a blisteringly hot Tuesday in August of 1883, the town square was packed with a mob hungry for a spectacle. Amira Preston, a 22-year-old bookkeeper with a sharp mind and an inconveniently strong moral compass, found herself bound to the rough-hewn timber of the public whipping post. Her cotton dress was torn at the collar, exposing her left shoulder. Sheriff Josiah Cobb, a man whose badge was entirely bought and paid for by the Higgins Mining Company, held a glowing iron fresh from the blacksmith's forge. The tip of the iron was forged into a crude, cruel letter T, thief. Amira had not stolen a single dime. She had, however, made the fatal mistake of auditing Cornelius Higgins' private ledgers and discovering that the wealthy baron was systematically embezzling from the Widows and Orphans Fund to finance a private militia. When she tried to take the evidence to a federal judge in Helena, Higgins' men had intercepted her stagecoach. They planted $300 of marked company payroll in her carpet bag. In Blackwood Gulch, stealing from the company was a hanging offense, but Higgins, playing the benevolent patriarch, had magnanimously suggested branding and exile instead. He wanted her ruined, ensuring no one would ever believe a branded thief if she tried to speak the truth. "Hold her steady, boys," Sheriff Cobb spat, a stream of dark tobacco juice hitting the dust near Amira's boots. Amira bit down on the leather strap they had forced between her teeth. She refused to cry. She locked her trembling knees and stared with fierce, burning hatred at the saloon balcony, where Cornelius Higgins stood smoking a cigar, enjoying the show. The glowing iron descended. The hiss of scorching flesh was loud in the sudden morbid silence of the square. The pain was a blinding, white-hot explosion that radiated down to her bones. Amira's vision swam, black edges closing in, but she forced her eyes to stay open. She would not give them the satisfaction of passing out. Then, the crowd suddenly parted. It wasn't a respectful parting. It was a scattering, born of primal instinct. A shadow fell over the whipping post. Stoney Montgomery did not walk through the town. He waded through it, like a massive ship, parting muddy waters. Standing 6'4", with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke, Stoney was a creature of the deep timber. He wore buckskins stained with grease and pine pitch, and a heavy cloak made from the hide of a silver-tip grizzly. A formidable thicket of a dark beard obscured his lower face, but his eyes, a piercing, glacial blue, missed nothing. He carried a massive Sharps buffalo rifle casually over one shoulder, and a Colt Dragoon rested on his hip. He was a mountain man, a relic of a bygone era, known to the townsfolk only as the Bear. He came down from the Bitterroot High Country twice a year to trade pelts for salt, coffee, and gunpowder. Stoney stopped in front of the post. He looked at the smoking wound on Amira's shoulder, then at the terrified deputies holding her ropes. "What's the price on this one?" Stoney's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the chest of everyone standing within 20 feet. Sheriff Cobb puffed out his chest, trying to maintain authority in the face of the towering hermit. "She ain't for sale, mountain man. She's a convicted thief. Justice has been served. Now we cut her loose to starve in the scrubland, as is the law." Stoney didn't look at the sheriff. He looked at Amira. Beneath the sweat, dirt, and agonizing pain, he saw something that struck a chord deep within his solitary chest. Her eyes were not the eyes of a broken dog. They were the eyes of a cornered hawk. "I need a swamper for the winter," Stoney stated, slowly reaching into the leather pouch tied to his heavy belt. He pulled out a raw gold nugget the size of a walnut and tossed it onto the dirt at Sheriff Cobb's boots. "That covers her supposed theft, her fines, and the cost of the rope you wasted tying her up. Cut her down." From the balcony, Higgins leaned over the rail. "Montgomery, you don't want that trouble. She's a liar and a thief. She won't last a week in the high country." Stoney finally shifted his gaze to the wealthy baron. The mountain man's stare was so cold it could freeze boiling water. "What happens on my mountain is my business, Higgins. Keep your dogs out of my woods." Before the sheriff could argue, Stoney drew a massive Bowie knife and, with two swift, fluid motions, severed the thick ropes binding Amira to the post. She pitched forward, her legs finally giving out, but she never hit the ground. Stoney caught her with one massive, calloused hand. He practically lifted her off her feet, tossing her over the saddle of his waiting pack mule, a stubborn beast named Goliath. "Hold on to the horn," Stoney muttered to her, his tone devoid of any gentleness, yet his grip was steady. "We got a long ride, and I don't stop for stragglers." Amira clung to the leather horn, her shoulders screaming in agony with every step the mule took. As they rode out of Blackwood Gulch, the townspeople watched in stunned silence. She was leaving the frying pan, only to be dragged directly into the frozen, unforgiving fire of the Bitterroot Range. Jagged rock, slippery pine needles, and air so thin it burned the lungs, transformed their ascent into the Bitterroot Range into a brutal, unforgiving test of endurance. For 3 agonizing days, they pushed higher into the wilderness. Amira drifted in and out of a dark, feverish haze. The seared flesh on her left shoulder throbbed with an angry, spreading infection, sending nauseating waves of agony radiating down to her fingertips with every jolting, uneven step of the pack mule. Yet, she stubbornly swallowed her whimpers, refusing to show weakness to the towering stranger, leading her into the unknown. When they paused to rest at nightfall, she forced her exhausted frame through the freezing underbrush to gather dry kindling with her good arm, stopping only when Stoney Montgomery gruffly ordered her to sit and conserve her fading strength. Stoney watched her intently over the crackling flames of their campfires, his glacial blue eyes missing nothing. He was a man who had retreated to these mountains a decade ago, seeking the brutal, uncomplicated honesty of nature after an unspoken tragedy had burned his previous life to ash. He preferred the howling of wolves to the deceitful whispers of men. Intervening in Blackwood Gulch had been an anomaly, an impulse born of the sheer, sickening injustice he had witnessed in the town square. He had expected the girl to weep, to beg, to crumble under the weight of her exile. But watching this half-dead, branded city girl refuse to break, he recognized a rare, kindred spirit forged in defiance. They finally broke through a dense, suffocating stand of lodgepole pines on the 4th afternoon, revealing a hidden alpine valley untouched by the corruption of the world below. Stoney's cabin sat nestled against a sheer granite cliff, overlooking a pristine, glass-like lake. It was a heavy, hand-hewn fortress of thick timber, built specifically to withstand the crushing weight and fury of high-country winters. He carried Amira inside, laying her gently on a bed framed with sturdy rope and covered in thick wolf pelts. For the next week, the heavy air inside the cabin smelled sharply of boiling water, pine pitch, and dried yarrow. Stoney tended her infected wound with unexpected, meticulous gentleness. His herbal poultices stung like angry hornets but steadily drew the poison and heat from her torn flesh, while the bitter willow bark tea he forced her to drink finally broke her raging fever. When Amira finally woke with a clear mind, the season's first snow was already dusting the frosted window panes. She pulled a heavy wool blanket to her chin, watching Stoney by the stone hearth as he silently, mechanically oiled the action of a Colt revolver. "Why?" Her voice was a raspy whisper, unused for days. Stoney paused, sliding the cylinder back into the frame with a satisfying metallic click. "You had more fight in you than the town gave you credit for. Out here, fight is the only currency that matters." "I am in your debt, Mr. Montgomery," she replied softly, yet her gaze held a fierce, unwavering clarity. "But you should know the whole truth. They didn't brand me over a missing payroll. I had undeniable proof that Cornelius Higgins was systematically draining the Widows and Orphans Fund to pay his private militia. I hid his private ledger before they intercepted my stagecoach." Stoney's oil rag hovered over the blued steel. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "Where?" "In the hollow base of the old water tower at the very edge of town. As long as that book exists, Higgins will hunt me to the ends of the earth. He knows I didn't break during the sheriff's interrogation." Stoney exhaled heavily, running a calloused hand through his dense, dark beard. "Well, little bird, it seems I bought myself a heap of trouble." Higgins will eventually send regulators up here before the high passes snow in completely. I can leave, Amira offered immediately, though the mere thought of facing the freezing wilderness alone terrified her. I won't bring your ruin to your doorstep. You'd freeze to death before you reach the tree line, Stoney grunted dismissively. He stood up, crossing the room to pull a heavy Winchester 73 lever-action rifle from the wall rack and tossed it unceremoniously onto her lap. The cold brass and oiled steel felt incredibly alien against her skin. If you're staying in my valley, you're going to learn how to defend it. I don't harbor victims. Training commenced at dawn the very next morning. The frigid mountain air bit harshly through her borrowed wool coat as Stoney lined up empty tin cans on a fallen log 50 yards away. Shooting isn't just about pulling a trigger, he instructed, standing behind her and adjusting her rigid stance with firm taps to the back of her knees. It's about breathing. It's about respecting the crosswinds. You have to squeeze the trigger, like you're trying not to wake a sleeping baby. Her first shot went wide, snapping a pine branch. The heavy recoil slammed viciously into her healing shoulder. She dropped to one knee, a sharp hiss of pure agony escaping her gritted teeth. Stoney stood over her, his expression unreadable. Does it hurt? Yes, she gasped. Good. Let the pain remind you of the ultimate cost of missing when your life is on the line. He hauled her up by her good arm. Load another round. The following weeks were a relentless, bruising crucible. Stoney proved to be a merciless instructor, forcing her to hold the heavy rifle steady until her arms shook uncontrollably and her muscles screamed for relief. He taught her how to calculate distance over blinding snow glare, how to compensate for bullet drop at 100 yards, and how to reload blindly in the pitch black of night. He pushed her past the point of exhaustion, systematically replacing her lingering fear with cold, mechanical precision and deadly focus. Beneath the grueling daily regimen, a profound mutual respect took root and blossomed. Amira discovered a lethal, latent aptitude for firearms. Her hands, previously accustomed only to the delicate scratching of fountain pens, grew calloused and steady. Her eyes, trained on tiny ledger columns, proved exceptionally sharp at picking out obscured targets in the dense brush. Stoney watched in silent awe as she shed the final remnants of the terrified girl from the gallows, replacing her with a hardened, capable survivor. He found himself acutely aware of her presence, the fierce determination setting in her jaw, the earthy scent of wood smoke clinging to her hair, the steady, calming rhythm of her breathing beside him on the firing line. Late one November afternoon, beneath a sky bruised deep purple with an impending massive blizzard, Amira lay prone in the snow, practicing with Stoney's massive Sharps buffalo rifle. She steadied the crosshairs on a small, white quartz rock resting on a granite ridge 300 yards away. She exhaled slowly, her heartbeat slowing down, finding the perfect, silent space between beats. She squeezed. The 50 to 90 cartridge roared, echoing like a thunderclap across the enclosed valley. 300 yards away, the quartz rock instantly shattered into a cloud of fine white dust. Stoney lowered his brass spyglass, a rare, genuine smile finally breaking through his dense beard. You shoot straighter than any son I could have ever hoped to raise, Abby. It was the very first time he had used a nickname. A flush of warm pride cut through the freezing air, blooming in her chest, but the victory was violently and abruptly cut short. Stoney stiffened. His head snapped sharply toward the lower switchback trail. The shifting wind carried a sound entirely alien to the isolated high country, the rhythmic, metallic clinking of horse tack, and the heavy, ominous crunch of boots marching on packed snow. He quickly leveled his spyglass at the distant, shadowed tree line. When he finally lowered it, his eyes were cold, hollow, and calculating. Higgins? Amira asked, scrambling to her feet and clutching the heavy buffalo rifle tightly to her chest. Worse, Stoney murmured, racking a fresh shell into his Winchester with a sharp clack. Dutch Caldwell and a half-dozen hired regulators. The deadliest bounty hunters Higgins could buy. The ledger might be safe in town, but they know you're the only one alive who can decipher the financial codes. He looked at her, his jaw set like carved granite. Time to see if my teaching actually took. The wind howling through the Bitterroot Range carried the undeniable scent of impending violence. Stony Montgomery did not wait for the trouble to knock on his heavy oak door. He was a creature of the wilderness. And in the wilderness, the predator who controls the high ground controls the outcome. "Take the sharps," Stony ordered, his voice a low, urgent rumble as he tossed a heavy leather bandolier of 50 to 90 cartridges onto the rough-hewn table. "Climb to the granite overhang above the switchback. The snow will hide your tracks if you move now. When they hit the choke point at Wolf Creek, I'll draw their fire. You give me overwatch." Amira's hands trembled, not from the biting cold seeping through the cabin's chinking, but from the sudden, terrifying reality of what she was being asked to do. The paper targets and quartz rocks were gone. "Stony, I've never shot a man." Stony stopped, his massive hands resting on his Winchester rifle. He stepped close to her, his glacial blue eyes softening just a fraction. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "They didn't come to arrest you, Abby. Dutch Caldwell is a gravedigger in a bowler hat. He gets paid by the body. If you don't shoot, we both die on this mountain, and Higgins gets away with starving half the county. You shoot to live. Understand?" Amira swallowed hard, the memory of the searing, branding iron flashing hot in her mind. She nodded, her jaw tightening. "I understand." 10 minutes later, Amira was crawling through knee-deep snow, dragging the heavy buffalo rifle up the icy incline. She reached the granite overhang, a natural sniper's nest cloaked by the sweeping, snow-laden branches of an ancient spruce. Below her, the trail narrowed treacherously where Wolf Creek had frozen into a jagged ravine. She brushed the snow from the rifle's sights and waited, her breath pluming in the freezing air. 30 agonizing minutes passed before the regulators appeared. Dutch Caldwell led the pack, his long black duster flapping like crow wings against the pristine white landscape. Behind him rode 5 hardened men, their rifles drawn, eyes scanning the tree line. Among them was Deacon Miller, a notorious gun-for-hire known for his ruthless precision. When they reached the frozen creek, Caldwell held up a gloved hand, halting his men. He sensed the trap just a second too late. From the dense timber to their left, Stony unleashed hell. He didn't aim for the men first, he aimed for the environment. His first shot severed a thick hemp rope he had rigged hours earlier. A massive, dead widowmaker pine came crashing down the slope, smashing into the frozen creek bed and throwing jagged shards of ice into the air. One of the regulator's horses reared in panic, throwing its rider hard against the rocks. "Ambush! In the trees!" Caldwell bellowed, spurring his horse backward and drawing a pair of silver-plated revolvers. Gunfire erupted, shattering the pristine silence of the mountain. Stony moved like a ghost through the timber, firing, shifting position, and firing again. His Winchester barked with deadly rhythm, pinning the regulators behind the fallen pine and outcroppings of rock. But Caldwell's men were seasoned killers. They didn't panic for long. Deacon Miller scrambled up a snowy embankment, flanking Stony's position. Through the dense snowfall, Amira watched through her scope as Deacon leveled his repeating rifle directly at the cluster of rocks where Stony was reloading. Stony was blind to the flank. He had seconds to live. Amira's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You shoot to live," Stony's voice echoed in her mind. She settled the crosshairs squarely on the center of Deacon's chest. She exhaled, forcing her trembling hands to still. She found the empty space between her heartbeats. She squeezed the trigger. The Sharps rifle roared, the recoil violently slamming into her shoulder, dangerously close to her healing brand. Down below, Deacon Miller was violently thrown backward off the embankment, as if struck by a runaway locomotive, vanishing into the snowdrift below. The sheer thunder of the buffalo gun echoing from the cliffs sent a wave of panic through the remaining regulators. "Sniper on the ridge! It's the bear!" one of the men screamed. "Fall back!" Caldwell ordered, realizing they were caught in a crossfire in terrain they didn't understand. "Back down the pass!" Stony fired 2 more warning shots into the dirt at their horses' hooves, ensuring their retreat was chaotic and swift. As the sounds of panicked hooves faded down the mountain, a heavy, eerie silence reclaimed the valley. Amira lay in the snow, the smoking rifle beside her, tears of adrenaline and shock freezing on her cheeks. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. 10 minutes later, she scrambled down the ridge to find Stony leaning heavily against the fallen pine. The snow around his right boot was stained a brilliant, shocking crimson. "Stony!" she cried, dropping the rifle and rushing to his side. He offered a grim, strained smile, his face pale under the dark beard. "You shoot straight, little bird, but Caldwell's boys shoot fast." Caught a ricochet off the granite. He grunted in pain as he tried to put weight on the leg. "We need to get to the cabin. This storm is about to break, and they'll freeze to death if they don't keep riding down. We have the night." Supporting his massive weight over her shoulders, Amira became the very strength that Stony had poured into her over the past months. The mountain man had saved her life. Now, it was her turn to save his. The blizzard hit with the fury of a scorned god. By nightfall, the temperature plummeted, and the wind tore relentlessly at the cabin's heavy roof shingles. Inside, the stone hearth blazed, casting long, dancing shadows across the log walls as Amira stripped away Stony's blood-soaked buckskins. The bullet had torn deeply through the meaty part of his outer thigh. It was a vicious, bleeding wound, but it had miraculously missed the femoral artery and the bone. "I have to clean it with whiskey, Stony," she warned, holding a soaked rag. "It's going to burn." Stony lay back on the heavy wolf pelts, his chest heaving with the onset of fever. He gripped the heavy wooden frame of the bed. "Do it." She poured the high-proof liquor directly into the torn flesh. Stony's entire body went rigid, a guttural groan tearing from his throat, but he didn't pull away. With hands steadied by pure adrenaline and necessity, Amira stitched the wound closed with needle and catgut, wrapping it tightly in clean linen. For 2 agonizing days, the storm raged. Stony drifted in and out of a dark, feverish delirium, muttering fragmented regrets of a buried life, a woman named Mary, a burning farmhouse, and a violent vengeance that had ultimately exiled him to the high country. Amira rarely left his side, forcing bitter willow bark tea past his lips and pressing snow-packed rags to his burning forehead. On the 3rd evening, the fever finally broke. Stony opened his eyes, the glacial blue clear and focused once more, to find Amira asleep in the rocking chair beside him. She looked utterly exhausted, yet fiercely indomitable. He shifted, wincing at the stiffness in his leg. The movement woke her. "You're back," she breathed, profound relief washing over her soot-stained face as she immediately offered him a tin cup of water. "You make a fair doctor, Miss Preston," Stony rasped, his voice rough. "And you make a terrible patient," she replied. A faint, weary smile touching her lips. Stony looked from his bandaged leg to her eyes. The walls he had built around his heart over a decade of brutal isolation were cracking, dismantled by the quiet, fierce loyalty of the woman beside him. "I'm sorry, Abby," he murmured. "I pulled you from that gallows, only to drag you into a war. Caldwell won't stop hunting us." Amira set the cup down and stood tall. "Before you brought me to this mountain, I was a victim. A girl waiting for a mob to destroy her for simply telling the truth." She reached up, unbuttoning the collar of her wool shirt, and pulled the fabric off her left shoulder. The brand was fully healed now, a stark, puckered, T-scarred permanently into her pale skin. "They put this on me to mark me as a thief," she said, her voice completely devoid of shame. "But out here, you taught me how to survive. You taught me how to fight back. This doesn't stand for thief anymore, Stony. It stands for truth. And I will fight for it, right alongside you." Stony stared at the scar, profoundly moved by the raw defiance in her spirit. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand gently resting over the scarred flesh. The contrast between his weathered fingers and her skin was stark, yet entirely right. "You are the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. When she leaned down, the kiss was not hesitant. It was a desperate, passionate collision of 2 survivors, tasting of wood smoke, whiskey, and the profound relief of not facing the brutal world alone. Stony pulled her down, his massive arms wrapping around her like a fortress. For one night, the war outside didn't matter. They were safe, in the warmth of the hearth and the newly discovered fire between them. The twist. They spent the next week snowed in, completely isolated from the world below. Stoney's immense physical constitution fought off the lingering infection, and his leg healed rapidly. They believed the impassable winter had bought them until the spring thaw. They believed Caldwell had retreated to Blackwood Gulch to lick his wounds. They were catastrophically wrong. Dutch Caldwell was not a man who surrendered to weather. While Stoney and Amira found solace in the cabin, Caldwell's surviving men had fashioned crude snowshoes from willow branches. For a week, they painstakingly hauled heavy wooden crates up the treacherous back face of the mountain, bypassing the main trail entirely. It happened at midnight. Amira was asleep against Stoney's chest when a sharp, distinct hiss cut through the howling wind. It sounded like a massive, angry snake right outside the timber walls. Stoney's eyes snapped open, his wilderness instincts screaming a warning a second before his conscious mind caught up. "Dynamite," he breathed. He grabbed Amira by the waist, violently hauling her off the bed and throwing her toward the heavy, iron-ringed root cellar trapdoor in the floorboards. "Get in," he roared, grabbing his Colt revolver from the nightstand. He barely threw the heavy door open when the night detonated. The explosion was deafening. The entire front wall of the cabin splintered outward in a horrific shower of burning logs, iron nails, and shattered glass. The concussive wave threw Stoney backward, knocking the breath from his lungs and burying him under a pile of smoking debris. The roof groaned and partially collapsed, exposing the ruined interior to the blinding blizzard. Through the massive, smoking crater where their front door used to be, Dutch Caldwell and his men appeared. They stood in knee-deep snow, rifles raised, illuminated by the hellish flames of the burning cabin. "Mountain Man!" Caldwell's triumphant voice boomed over the wind. "Throw out the girl and the ledger's location, and I might just let you freeze to death peacefully." Amira crawled from the cellar stairs, coughing through the thick smoke, her face streaked with soot. She looked at the armed men stepping into their ruined sanctuary, then at Stoney, who was struggling to push a heavy beam off his chest. Her hands closed tightly around the cold steel of the Winchester rifle buried in the snow beside her. The siege was no longer a distant threat. The war had come inside their home. Amira did not hesitate. The trembling girl who had been tied to a whipping post in Blackwood Gulch was gone, burned away by the harsh crucible of the high country. As Caldwell's deputy stepped into the cabin, raising his shotgun, Amira brought the Winchester to her shoulder. She didn't aim with her eyes. She aimed with the brutal muscle memory Montgomery had drilled into her. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the deputy crumpled backward into the snowdrift. "Return fire!" Caldwell roared, diving behind the remains of the heavy oak doorframe. Bullets chewed through the floorboards and shattered the remaining windows. Amira ducked back into the shallow depression of the root cellar stairs, racking another shell into the chamber. Wood splinters rained down on her like shrapnel. Across the room, a terrifying, guttural roar echoed from beneath the wreckage. Montgomery, fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline and the primal instinct to protect his territory, heaved with all his remaining strength. The massive, smoking roof beam that had pinned him shifted, groaning against his tremendous bulk, before finally rolling off his chest. He didn't stand up. With his injured leg throbbing, he rolled across the debris-littered floor, grabbing a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. Another regulator stepped through the breach, his repeater searching the gloom for Amira. Montgomery surged from the shadows like a wounded grizzly. He swung the iron poker with devastating force, striking the man's rifle and shattering the wooden stock into kindling, before driving the heavy iron into the man's ribs. The regulator dropped with a wheezing gasp. Caldwell, realizing the mountain man was free, abandoned his cover and fired blindly into the smoke. One bullet grazed Montgomery's shoulder, tearing through his heavy wool shirt. Montgomery grunted, diving behind the overturned dining table. "You're dead, mountain man!" Caldwell shouted, reloading his six-shooters with practiced mechanical speed. "You're bleeding out, your house is gone, and you've got nowhere to run. Give up the girl." "Amira!" Montgomery yelled over the howling wind, his voice strained. "The oil lamp! Above the hearth!" Amira looked up. Suspended by an iron chain above the stone fireplace was a heavy glass lantern brimming with kerosene. It was directly above where Caldwell was inching forward, using a fallen wall timber for cover. She understood instantly. She raised the Winchester, ignoring the freezing wind biting at her soot-stained face. She found the empty space between her rapid heartbeats. She fired. The bullet shattered the heavy glass. A gallon of highly flammable kerosene rained down over the timber and splashed across Caldwell's heavy duster. Before the bounty hunter could react, the raging flames from the open hearth licked the spilled fuel. In a fraction of a second, the front half of the ruined cabin erupted into an inferno. Caldwell screamed as his coat caught fire. Panic replaced his cold, calculating demeanor. He dropped his revolvers, frantically rolling in the snow that piled through the breached wall to extinguish the flames. His remaining men, terrified by the sudden wall of fire and the sheer brutality of the defense, broke rank and scrambled back down the treacherous, snow-blind mountain pass, abandoning their leader. Caldwell managed to smother the fire in a deep snowdrift, but his hands were blistered, and his weapons were lost in the burning wreckage of the cabin. He staggered to his feet, gasping for air, staring into the roaring flames. Through the smoke, Amira emerged. She stood on the edge of the blasted floorboards, the wind whipping her dark hair around her soot-streaked face. She held the Winchester level, the barrel pointed directly at Caldwell's chest. "It's over, Caldwell," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of the wind and fire. It was steady, devoid of fear. Caldwell looked at the girl he had been sent to kill, then at Montgomery, who had hauled himself upright using the stone fireplace, his glacial eyes locked on the bounty hunter. Caldwell raised his burned hands in surrender. He had lost. "Tie him to the timber," Montgomery rasped, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. "He's going to sit out this storm with us, and when the snow melts, he's going to testify." The winter that followed was the most punishing either of them had ever endured. With half the cabin destroyed, they lived in the reinforced root cellar, rationing their remaining food and using the debris of their home as firewood. Caldwell, bound hand and foot, was kept alive, a sullen and defeated prisoner in the darkest corner of the cellar. During those long, freezing months in the dark, Amira and Montgomery became inseparable. The bond forged in blood and fire solidified into something deep and immovable. He told her the rest of his story of the corrupted lawmen who had burned his farm in Kansas and forced him into exile. She told him of her dreams before Higgins had turned her into a hunted animal. They survived not just on dried meat and melted snow, but on the quiet, profound strength they found in each other. When the spring thaw finally arrived in late April, melting the impassable snowdrifts into rushing alpine waterfalls, they emerged from the cellar. The mountain air was crisp and smelled of damp pine and rebirth. They did not ride down to Blackwood Gulch. Riding into Higgins' stronghold would be suicide. Instead, Montgomery loaded Goliath, the pack mule, and they tied Caldwell to a second horse. They took the arduous High Ridge Trail heading north, a grueling 2-week journey toward the territorial capital of Helena. Upon arriving in the bustling city, they bypassed the local sheriff's office entirely. Armed with the water tower ledger, which Montgomery had quietly retrieved weeks before the blizzard, and a terrified Dutch Caldwell, they walked straight into the office of Territorial Governor John Schuyler Crosby. They demanded an audience with Chief Justice Decius Wade of the Montana Territorial Supreme Court. The evidence was undeniable. The ledger meticulously detailed years of extortion, theft, and the bribery of local officials, all penned in Cornelius Higgins's own hand. Paired with Caldwell's desperate confession to save himself from the gallows, the empire of the Blackwood Gulch mining baron began to crumble. 3 days later, U.S. Marshals rode into Blackwood Gulch. They found Cornelius Higgins attempting to board a private train car bound for San Francisco. He was arrested on federal charges of embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Sheriff Josiah Cobb surrendered without firing a shot, his bought and paid-for badge tossed into the mud of the town square. Amira stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in Helena, the warm spring sun beating down on her shoulders. She wore a new dress, high-collared and respectable, but beneath the fabric, the brand of the thief remained a permanent reminder of the fire she had walked through. A well-dressed federal clerk approached her, tipping his hat. "Miss Preston, Governor Crosby extends his gratitude. He has offered you a position within the Territorial Treasury Department. An honest accountant is hard to find these days." Amira smiled politely, but her eyes drifted past the clerk, over the bustling city streets, to the edge of town where a massive man in fresh buckskins stood holding the reins of two horses. Montgomery looked entirely out of place amidst the brick buildings and telegraph wires, a wild creature tethered to the edge of civilization. "Please convey my deepest thanks to the governor," Amira said softly, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. "But my home is in the high country." She walked down the steps, leaving the city and its promises of safety behind. She walked toward the mountain man who had pulled her from the gallows, the man who had taught her how to fight, how to survive, and how to trust again. Montgomery watched her approach, a rare, genuine smile crinkling the corners of his glacial blue eyes. He offered her a hand, pulling her effortlessly into the saddle beside him. "Ready to go home, little bird?" he asked, his deep voice vibrating with warmth. "Lead the way," Amira replied, resting her hand on the cold steel of the Winchester rifle scabbarded by her knee. They turned their horses toward the towering peaks of the Bitterroot Range, riding away from the world of men and back into the untamed wilderness. They had a cabin to rebuild and a lifetime of high country winters to conquer, together. Thank you for listening to this thrilling tale of survival and Wild West justice. If Amira and Montgomery's fight against the odds kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic storytelling, dramatic romance, and untamed adventures every single week. See you in the next video.